Let's just focus on to energy matters now. An independent political writer, Ebrahim Harvey, says the poor black majority are bearing the brunt of load shedding the most. Harvey says in the current electricity crisis, we're likely to see the rapid rise of independent power producers and the further decline of Eskom as a state public entity and electricity provider to the detriment of the black working class. He joins us now to discuss this further. He's penned a piece which we will get into. Thank you very much for availing yourself this afternoon. Perhaps what stands out the most in your piece is your criticism of the way the media has handled the information sharing or knowledge sharing where Eskom is concerned. You note that what was sorely lacking from the media's coverage of the electricity crisis is a critical analysis of the reasons given by Eskom for the latest round of load shedding. Why?
Well, there's much to be said in response to your question, but quite clearly what is emerging for quite a long while now, because of the palpable failures of Eskom, and particularly now with the drastic load shedding we've seen in the past 2 weeks. And in fact, 2022 was on record the worst load shedding ever in the history of Eskom. There's a move now. There's a move now and a concerted move towards independent power producers, which is in fact the private sector. And this is the result of the accumulated failures of the ANC. All SOEs, it has totally mismanaged and messed up, particularly Eskom and Transnet. And this is why people are now, including the middle classes, beginning to think that moving towards independent power producers, the private sector, is going to resolve the problems. Now, the thing is, it might resolve it, because they could afford to pay, they can afford to buy renewables, etc. The working class majority are struggling to even, buy paraffin stoves, those type of things, to deal with load shedding. So it's going to be a very big problem. The move towards independent power producers might help the middle class. The overwhelming majority of people in this country comes from this poor black working class majority. And they cannot pay for renewables. There are a whole lot of different forms that this is taking, and none of these forms is affordable to the working class majority. And this is the import of the article that I penned, that the media did not interrogate what the consequences was going to be for, and at the worst moment of social crisis, deepening black poverty, unemployment, and inequalities ever in the history of this country. What is going to happen to the working class majority who cannot afford to pay for alternative energy sources? This is the big problem. And I've not read any media dealing with, editorially or in an opinion piece, that deals with what lies at the bottom of what is going to happen with this move now towards independent power producers, which is just another term for the private sector. And they're going to move into this vacuum because of the serious, unprecedented crisis in electricity, and particularly seen what has happened in the past 2 weeks of the worst load shedding we've ever experienced. What the ANC doesn't realize it has done as a result of the failures of Eskom and Transnet is that anything that smacks of nationalization or state ownership and control has now been given a very bad image. They're going to struggle even, I believe, to get off the ground a state bank that they are talking about. Anything now where the state controls and owns that resource and delivers services is going to be, I believe, contaminated by what has happened to Eskom in particular. So the whole notion of nationalization and state ownership and control really lies in tatters now. And the private sector is going to move into that gap and exploit it to the full.
Mr. Harvey, if you'd please allow me to join you there and you can expand on that point, right? I think at the heart or the crux of your opinion piece, you are looking at the impacts that this move to independent power producers or the private sector will have on the black working class. Break it down for us. What is the impact? You speak of people not being able to afford paraffin, etc., but just break it down a bit further for us in terms of the impact taking this move will have.
Yeah, I mean, it goes without saying, you speak about it in the media, in all forms of the media, the worst poverty ever. I mean, people are struggling. You're talking about paraffin, to buy candles, matches. This is what people are struggling to. They're struggling to put food on the table. You've got to get this context within which this load shedding has occurred. It's the worst time ever. Especially we're talking of 11, 12 million people walking the streets. So the affordability, it may be desirable in the light of the Eskom crisis, and we've seen what has happened in the past 2 weeks, to go the route of the private sector, independent power producers. The question I've raised is that the media is not unraveling. They're not exploring what the consequence is going to be for the black working class majority, who cannot afford to go these different alternative routes. I mean, there's battery inverters. There's a whole lot of different things that you could do if you had the money when you've got load shedding. I mean, I've got a battery inverter, so when I've got load shedding, because I work with deadlines with my articles, I had to get a battery inverter to assist me. Who can afford to buy that? There are many other different forms of renewable energy. As an alternative to Eskom, which has been particularly centered around the coal-fired power stations. And this is the problem. They're expensive. You see, this is the thing, and that's why the middle class, and better off people might be able now to forced into exploring alternatives to Eskom. But it's not going to be so easy for the black working class majority that is steeped in the worst poverty and unemployment ever. That is the point that I've tried to, drive home in that column of yesterday.
Sure. The black working class majority could be very well argued that people in traditional South African townships, people in rural areas have always had a load shedding problem, right? There's research that was done by the University of Johannesburg about intermittent power cuts, mainly in South African townships. So this is nothing new, and people have learned how to get by. You speak of candles, you speak of paraffin, but there are people who are arguably even 36, 37, who would wake up in the morning, boil water, bath, go to school, and life goes on. And so this is just a continuation of what has always been happening for the black working class, if you will.
But the thing is, if these problems are not addressed, and this problem, the crisis in Eskom is a state-centric public utility. This is the problem with, once you abandon that route, you go into independent power producers, and accessing electricity becomes so much more difficult, as I've indicated now. You need to be able to pay for these renewable energy sources. And we do not have a working class majority that is in a position to pursue that path. That is what I'm saying. To be saying that working class people have been struggling all along, more of it is not going to make it. It will. It's become much more difficult. If people are struggling to put food on the table, I mean, it's also accompanied by a huge increasing electricity and water crisis. Look around the country. Besides electricity, look at what's happening to water supply across the country. And this is the context, the broader context within which the load shedding has occurred this week. And, it's a serious crisis that Eskom confronts at the moment. And unfortunately, I hear the former President Mbeki and Motlanthe saying that, the change that's required is that engineers have to take control of Eskom. But how come, all along, I mean, there's been many times that CEOs, for example, did not have engineering skills. the ANC has to face the fact that they have failed because of what has happened in Eskom. They have failed to make this an effective public utility in the interest of people and the poor majority especially. The chairperson of the board of Eskom, Professor Makgoba, very intelligent person who heads that board, has never once spoken that, you know, the reason for the failures of Eskom is that we need engineers on top. There's nothing like that the CEO necessarily has to have engineering expertise. It is what the ANC has done to Eskom, and you've seen what has come out of the Zondo Commission of Inquiry to tell you what has happened. That is the problem. Not that the CEO necessarily has to have engineering skills. You know, it's a misnomer. And I mean, I study public basic services. It is absolutely false that the CEO of Eskom has to necessarily have engineering skills. No, it's not the case at all. And, you know, we're failing to address the root cause of the problems by now, suddenly now. The ANC is waking up suddenly to say now that we need engineers on the top. And obviously they're also referring to the rater. And I don't believe it at all. I don't believe it.
Mr. Harvey, do you perhaps, I beg your pardon, do you perhaps perceive, or are you saying in a nutshell, that the collapse of Eskom is deliberate? It's a deliberate move to privatize it?
Well, you know, there are arguments. You know, for example, what happened in the city of Joburg, they talked up, that's the phrase, they talked up the crisis in 1997. And you've seen the Goli 2002 program that emerged that went the way of commercialization and corporatization. And in fact, in the literature, there's much to be said that sometimes public utilities in the age of neoliberalism is deliberately run into the ground so that the private sector can rescue it. And that I don't believe there's not, you know, sufficient evidence to say that this is what has been deliberately done by the Reiter and the executive team of Eskom, now or before. But there's many arguments that has been made that sometimes a public service is deliberately run into the ground, you know, so that the private sector can enter and, you know, supposedly rescue an ailing, crisis-ridden public sector. You know, there's much to be said, but there's no tangible evidence that without any doubt that this is deliberately what has been done by Eskom executives. It's very debatable. That's the problem.
Ebrahim Harvey is an independent political writer. Thank you very much, sir, for availing yourself on this Sunday.